The forest was old, older than the village at its edge, older than the stories told by the elders who sat by the fire on winter nights. Its trees stood tall and silent, their branches weaving a roof of leaves that softened the sunlight into a gentle, green-tinted glow. Birds flitted between the boughs, their songs brief and sweet, but the woman walking beneath them heard none of it. Her footsteps were slow, as if the earth itself tugged at her boots, begging her to stop. She didn't know why she had come here, only that the noise of the village, the chatter, the laughter, the clatter of carts on cobblestones had become too much. The weight inside her chest had grown so heavy that even breathing felt like a chore. She wore a plain woolen shawl, its edges frayed from years of wear, and her hands clutched it tightly around her shoulders as if it might shield her from something unseen. Her eyes, though dry now, bore the redness of too many tears shed in the dark. The villagers whispered about her sometimes, how she had once been lively, how she used to smile at the children playing in the square. But that was before. Before the silence had settled into her home, before the empty chair at her table had become a constant, aching reminder. A breeze stirred the leaves, and for a moment, the woman paused, lifting her face as if searching for something in the rustling branches. But there was nothing. Only the quiet. Only the loneliness that had become her shadow. She sank onto a moss-covered stone, her fingers tracing the grooves in its surface, without really feeling them. The forest around her was alive, creatures moving in the underbrush, the distant murmur of a brook, but she felt separate from it all, as though she were wrapped in a fog no one else could see. Then, a sound. Small, light, unmistakable. The crunch of footsteps over twigs. The woman did not look up at first, assuming it was a deer or some woodland creature passing by. But then, "Why are you sad?" The voice was young, bright as the first notes of a morning bird. The woman startled, turning to see a child standing a few paces away, her head tilted in curiosity. She was small, perhaps 6 or 7, with wild curls the color of autumn leaves and eyes that seemed to hold their own light. A simple linen dress, patched at the hem, swayed around her knees as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet knowing, as if she had seen sadness many times before and was not afraid of it. The woman opened her mouth, then closed it again. How could she explain a grief so deep it had no name? How could she tell this child that some wounds never truly heal? But the little girl did not wait for an answer. She stepped forward, her small hand outstretched, fingers slightly sticky, as children's hands often are. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft but certain. "My daddy can fix sad people." The woman almost smiled at the simplicity of it, as if sadness were a torn cloak that could be mended with needle and thread. But there was something in the girl's face's steadiness, a kindness that made the woman's throat tighten. "Can he?" she whispered, more to herself than to the child. The little girl nodded firmly. "Yes. He fixed the blacksmith when his hands stopped working. And he fixed the baker's wife when her heart hurt too much to bake." She reached out, her tiny fingers brushing the woman's wrist. "Come with me. Please." Something inside the woman, something tired and broken, ached at the touch. She had not realized how long it had been since someone had reached for her without pity, without hesitation. And so, though every step felt like a surrender to something she did not yet understand, she let the child lead her deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the light fell in golden streaks upon the path. The girl's hand was warm in hers, and for the first time in a very long while, the woman did not feel entirely alone. The deeper they walked into the forest, the more the world seemed to change around them. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and wide, roots twisting up from the earth like the fingers of old storytellers reaching for the sky. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in scattered patches, painting the mossy ground with shifting patterns of gold and shadow. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, with the faintest hint of wood smoke curling beneath it, a secret whisper of warmth in the wilderness. The little girl moved with the sure-footedness of someone who knew every root and stone along the path, her steps light and quick, her small hand tugging the woman forward with gentle insistence. The woman followed, her earlier weariness giving way to a quiet curiosity. She had lived near these woods for years, yet she had never ventured this far in. The villagers spoke of the deep forest in hushed tones, warning children not to stray too far lest they lose their way. But the girl walked as if she had never known fear, as if the trees themselves were old friends keeping watch over her. The woman glanced down at their joined hands, her own fingers rough and worn, clasped around the child's tiny, trusting grip, and felt something stir inside her, something faint and fragile, like the first green shoot of a plant breaking through winter-hardened soil. Then, as if the forest had been holding its breath, the trees parted to reveal a clearing. And there, nestled between two great oaks as though they had grown around it on purpose, stood a cabin. It was small but sturdy, its walls built of logs darkened with age, its roof thick with shingles worn smooth by years of rain and wind. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, and the windows round and paned with thick, wavy glass glowed with the warm light of a fire within. A low wooden fence, more decorative than functional, ringed the front yard, where herbs grew in neat, fragrant rows, their leaves brushing against one another in the breeze. The girl let go of the woman's hand and bounded ahead, her bare feet kicking up little puffs of earth as she ran. "Daddy," she called, her voice bright as a bell. "I brought her." For a moment, the woman hesitated at the edge of the clearing. She had followed the child on impulse, driven by something she couldn't name, but now that she stood before the strange, hidden place, doubt crept in. Who lived here? Why would they help a stranger? What if this was all some foolish hope, some trick of the light and her own weary heart? But before she could turn back, the cabin door opened. A man stepped out tall and broad-shouldered, his face lined with the kind of weathering that came from years of wind and work rather than age. His hair, dark but streaked with silver, was tied back loosely, and his hands, rough and scarred, rested at his sides with an easy stillness. His eyes, though they were what caught her, deep-set and quiet, they held a knowing, a patience, as if he had long ago learned to listen to things most people never heard. He did not speak at first, only studied her with a gaze that felt neither intrusive nor dismissive. Then, with a small nod, as if he had seen all he needed to, he stepped aside and held the door open wider. The girl, already halfway up the steps, turned and beckoned eagerly. "Come inside," she said. "It's safe." The woman exhaled, her breath trembling slightly. She had not realized how cold she was until the promise of warmth beckoned. Slowly, she crossed the clearing, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. As she climbed the steps, the scent of herbs and something baking, bread, perhaps drifted out to meet her. The man still did not speak, but his silence was not unfriendly. It was the quiet of someone who understood that some things could not be rushed. Inside, the cabin was dim but cozy, the fire in the hearth casting flickering light across wooden walls lined with shelves of jars, dried plants, roots, bundles of leaves tied with twine. A large, worn table dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred from years of use, and in one corner, a spinning wheel sat idle, a half-finished thread still caught in its spindle. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, herbs, and something sweet. Honey, maybe, or dried fruit. The girl scampered to the hearth, where a kettle hung over the fire, and busied herself with cups while the man closed the door behind them. The woman stood awkwardly just inside the threshold, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her shawl. She did not know what to say, how to explain why she had come. But the man did not ask. Instead, he reached for a thick woolen blanket folded over a chair and held it out to her. "Sit," he said, his voice low and steady. "Rest." 2 words, simple and unassuming, yet they unraveled something in her. Her legs, as if obeying without her permission, carried her to the chair by the fire. She sank into it, the blanket heavy and warm around her shoulders. The girl brought her a cup of tea, steam curling from its surface, the scent of chamomile and something earthy rising with it. "Drink," the girl said, mimicking her father's quiet tone. "It helps." The woman cupped the drink in her hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers. She did not know what she had expected when she followed the child. Certainly not this quiet kindness, this unspoken understanding. The man moved to the table, his back to her as he began chopping herbs with a practiced hand, giving her space, letting her breathe. The girl sat cross-legged at her feet, humming a tuneless little song under her breath. Outside, The wind sighed through the trees, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth. And for the first time in a very long time, the woman did not feel like she needed to speak at all. Night settled over the cabin like a heavy quilt, muffling the world beyond its walls into a hushed tapestry of rustling leaves and distant owl calls. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing like a slow heartbeat, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted across the wooden floor. The woman sat motionless in her chair, her fingers curled around the now empty cup, its warmth long faded. She had not moved for what felt like hours, caught in the strange stillness of this place, where time seemed to bend and stretch in ways she didn't understand. The man Elias, as the girl had called him, had moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, tidying jars, stirring a pot of stew that had filled the air with the rich scent of herbs and slow-cooked meat, but never pressing her with questions, never demanding anything of her at all. The girl, Mira, had been the opposite of flicker of movement in the dim light, chattering softly as she laid out blankets, as she fetched a worn doll from a basket by the hearth and tucked it against the woman's side with solemn care. "Her name is Twig," she'd whispered, as if sharing a great secret. "She listens when you can't talk." The woman had looked down at the doll, its stitched smile crooked but kind, and something tight in her chest had loosened, just a little. Now, as the last of the daylight bled from the windows, Elias finally approached her. He carried something small in his hands, a wooden bird, its wings smoothed by years of handling, its body no larger than her palm. Without a word, he placed it gently into her hands. The wood was warm, as if it had been held close to the fire, and the grain of it swirled in patterns that seemed alive in the flickering light. "It doesn't sing," Mira piped up from where she sat on the floor, her chin propped in her hands. "Not really. But sometimes, when you hold it just right, it feels like it might." The woman turned the bird over in her fingers. It was simple, unadorned, but there was a weight to it that had nothing to do with its size. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she could speak at all without the tears she'd held back for so long finally breaking free. But Elias didn't seem to expect words. He simply nodded toward the hearth, where a pile of furs had been laid out for her. "Sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is its own thing." She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to ask why he was helping her, why his daughter had led her here, what magic, if any, lived in this cabin tucked away from the world. But her body was heavier than she'd ever known it to be, her limbs sluggish with exhaustion she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. So she only nodded, clutching the wooden bird to her chest as she moved to the makeshift bed. Mira scrambled up to help, tugging the furs around her with surprising strength for such small hands. "Sometimes," the girl murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "the sad gets so big it feels like it'll never fit inside you. But Daddy says sadness is like water. It finds its own way out if you let it." Then, with a pat to the woman's shoulder that felt oddly wise for a child, she darted off to her own cot in the corner. The woman lay there, staring up at the ceiling, where the firelight painted shifting shapes between the beams. The bird was still in her hands, its wings pressing lightly into her palm. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not dream of empty chairs, of silence where there should have been laughter. Instead, she dreamed of trees great, towering things with roots that ran deep, so deep they touched something vast and innumerable beneath the earth. And somewhere, far off but unmistakable, the sound of wings. When she woke, the fire was still burning, and the weight in her chest was not gone, but it was lighter. As if, in the night, something had loosened its grip. Dawn crept into the cabin like a cautious visitor, its pale fingers slipping through the cracks in the shutters and painting hesitant stripes of gold across the wooden floor. The woman awoke slowly, her body heavy with a sleep deeper than any she had known in years. For a moment, she lay still, blinking up at the rough-hewn beams above her, unsure of where she was. Then the scent of wood smoke and herbs wrapped around her, and the memories of the previous evening settled into place: the forest, the child, the quiet man with knowing eyes. The wooden bird still rested in her palm, its wings pressed lightly against her skin, as if it had kept vigil through the night. She sat up, the furs sliding from her shoulders, and looked around. The cabin was empty save for Elias, who stood at the table with his back to her, grinding something in a mortar with slow, deliberate strokes. The rhythmic scrape of pestle against stone filled the silence between them. Mira was nowhere to be seen, no small figure darting between the shelves, no bright voice humming off-key tunes. The woman's fingers tightened around the bird. Elias turned then, as if sensing her wakefulness, and nodded toward the hearth, where a pot of porridge steamed gently. "Eat," he said, his voice as steady as it had been the night before. "Myra's gone wandering. She'll be back by midday." The woman rose, her limbs stiff but not unpleasantly so, and moved to the hearth. The porridge was thick and sweet with honey, studded with dried berries that burst like tiny secrets against her tongue. She ate slowly, savoring the warmth of it, the simplicity. Elias returned to his work, his silence comfortable, giving her space to gather her thoughts. When the bowl was empty, she set it aside and finally spoke. "Why did she bring me here?" Elias paused, his hands stilling over the mortar. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he lifted his head, his gaze meeting hers, and she saw something in his eyes, something old and weathered, like the bark of the trees outside. "She has a way of finding what's lost," he said at last. "Always has." The woman frowned. "But why you? Why this place?" He exhaled, a sound like wind through leaves, and set the mortar aside. "Because once I was lost too." The admission hung between them, heavy and unadorned. The woman waited, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he crossed to the window and pushed the shutters open wider, letting the morning light flood in. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, its greens and golds shimmering with dew. "Mira thinks you need fixing," he said after a while, his voice quieter now. "But fixing isn't always what's needed. Sometimes it's just being seen." The woman looked down at the bird in her hands, its wooden wings smooth under her fingertips. She thought of the girl's bright eyes, her unshakable certainty that her father could mend what was broken. And she thought of Elias's silence, his hands that moved with such purpose but never rushed, never demanded. "Who fixed you?" she asked softly. Elias stilled. For a heartbeat, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then he turned back to the table, picking up the mortar again. "Someone who's gone now," he said, and the finality in his voice told her all she needed to know. The woman didn't press further. Some griefs were too vast for words. Instead, she stood and carried her bowl to the wash basin, rolling up her sleeves to help. Elias didn't stop her. They worked in silence, side by side, the morning stretching on around them. And though the weight in her chest hadn't vanished, it felt different now, not lighter, exactly, but shared. As if, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't carrying it alone. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, a bird sang, its voice bright and clear. The woman listened, and for a moment, just a moment, she almost believed it was answering her. The forest beyond the cabin was alive with mid-morning sounds, the rustle of squirrels scampering through the underbrush, the distant hammering of a woodpecker, the occasional sigh of wind nudging the treetops. The woman stood at the open door, breathing in air that tasted of damp earth and pine resin, watching as sunlight pooled in patches along the winding path Mira had taken hours before. She should have felt restless waiting for the girl's return, yet a peculiar calm had settled over her, as if time here moved differently, bending to accommodate stillness. Behind her, Elias moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, bundling dried herbs, mending a fishing net spread across the table, his presence as steady as the hearth fire. A sudden commotion at the tree line broke the quiet. Twigs snapped, leaves thrashed, and then Mira burst into the clearing, her cheeks flushed pink with exertion, her wild curls tangled with bits of fern. Cradled against her chest was a small, trembling shape, a rabbit, its fur matted and one hind leg dangling at an unnatural angle. The girl's eyes were wide with urgency as she skidded to a stop before the woman. "You have to help," Mira gasped, thrusting the creature toward her without hesitation. He stepped wrong in a trap, not the metal kind, just a tangle of roots, but he can't run now and the foxes will smell it. The woman instinctively reached out, her hands closing around the rabbit's fragile warmth. It shuddered, its rapid heartbeat thrumming against her palms, its dark eyes bright with fear. She had never tended an animal before, had never been entrusted with something so small and breakable, yet before she could protest, Mira was already dragging her toward the table where Elias stood. "We need the willow strips," the girl declared, scrambling onto a stool to reach a high shelf. And the sticky salve, no. The yellow jar, not the green, and something for a splint. Elias said nothing, only nodded and began gathering the requested items with the ease of long practice. The woman stood frozen, the rabbit's quick breaths puffing against her wrist, until Mira whirled back and pressed a roll of thin linen into her free hand. "Hold him just so," the girl instructed, guiding the woman's fingers into position around the rabbit's uninjured limbs. "Daddy will show you how to set the bone." And then, without preamble, Elias was beside her, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness as he examined the leg. His touch was sure, unhurried, as if broken things mended themselves simply by trusting him to know the way. "Like this," he murmured, guiding her fingers to brace the tiny limb as he aligned the bone with one deft motion. The rabbit jerked but didn't struggle, as if sensing the intention behind the pain. Mira chattered ceaselessly as they worked, handing Elias strips of willow bark to fashion a splint, dabbing salve onto the swollen joint with meticulous care. The woman found herself drawn into their rhythm, holding the rabbit steady as Elias bound the splint, tearing strips of linen at Myra's insistence, even murmuring nonsense reassurances to the creature when its nose twitched in distress. The task demanded her full attention, leaving no room for the heavy thoughts that usually clouded her mind. By the time they finished, the sun had climbed high above the trees. The rabbit, now snugly wrapped in its tiny splint, lay quiet in a nest of moss-lined straw Mira had arranged near the hearth. The girl beamed up at the woman, her hands sticky with salve, her earlier urgency replaced with satisfaction. "See? You're good at fixing too," she declared, as if this were an irrefutable truth. The woman looked down at her own hands stained with herb juices, marked by the rabbit's frantic claws, and felt something unfamiliar unfurl in her chest. Not happiness, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the quiet satisfaction of being useful, of having her hands occupied with mending rather than emptiness. Elias was watching her, his expression unreadable. "You've a steady touch," he said simply, and the words settled into her like a stone sinking into still water. Mira tugged at her sleeve then, already racing toward the door. "Come on. We have to pick fresh camphor for his poultice. It grows by the stream where the rocks make singing sounds when you step on them." The woman hesitated, glancing back at Elias. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod, as if granting permission for something she hadn't realized she needed. And so she followed the girl into the sun-dappled woods, the rabbit's fate now inexplicably twined with her own, the morning's unexpected task lingering in her hands like a gift she hadn't known how to ask for. Somewhere beyond the trees, the stream murmured its approval. The woman walked a little straighter as she followed Myra's skipping form, the weight in her chest not gone, but different, not quite so heavy as before. Twilight draped itself over the cabin in soft violet hues, the last embers of sunset smoldering behind the trees like a banked fire. The woman sat on the cabin's narrow porch, her fingers idly tracing the grooves of the wooden bird in her lap. The day had been long and strangely full, gathering herbs by the singing stream with Mira, preparing poultices under Elias's quiet guidance, watching the injured rabbit's ears twitch as it nibbled clover from the girl's palm. Now, with the evening air cooling against her skin and the first stars peering through the branches, she felt a peculiar lightness, as if some tightly wound knot inside her had loosened without her noticing. The door creaked open behind her and Mira slipped out, balancing a chipped clay bowl piled high with wild strawberries. She plopped down beside the woman, her legs swinging, and offered the bowl without a word. The berries were small and imperfect, some still bearing the dents of hasty picking, their sweetness intensified by the warmth of the girl's hands. The woman took one, the juice bursting tart and bright on her tongue. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, watching fireflies blink awake in the gathering dark. Then Mira tilted her head, her gaze fixed on the woman's face with the unnerving directness only children possess. "Do you believe in happy endings?" she asked abruptly. The question caught the woman off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, the taste of strawberries lingering. What could she say? That happy endings were for stories, not for women who woke to empty houses and silence? That some losses carved holes too deep to ever truly fill? But before she could form an answer, Mira plowed on, undeterred. "Daddy says happy endings aren't really endings at all. the girl announced, popping a berry into her mouth. They're just places where you stop telling the story because your hands get tired from holding the book. She wiped her sticky fingers on her dress, leaving faint pink streaks. But I think happy endings are everywhere, even when they're hiding. Like when we found the rabbit. That was a happy middle, and his ending's still getting written. The woman stared at her, the wooden bird forgotten in her lap. There was something unsettling about the girl's words, something that nudged at the edges of her carefully constructed resignation. She thought of Elias's hand setting the tiny bone, of the way the rabbit had stopped trembling when wrapped in its mossy nest. Small mercies, yes, but mercies all the same. Mira leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You don't have to believe yet. Daddy says believing takes practice, like learning to whistle or skipping stones. She grinned, a flash of white in the dim light. I couldn't skip stones at all last summer, and now I can make them jump 3 times. You just have to keep trying. A log shifted in the hearth inside, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The woman exhaled slowly, watching the fireflies dance. Perhaps belief was like that small sparks against the dark, easy to miss unless you were looking. Mira scrambled to her feet then, dusting berry stains from her skirt. Come on, she said, tugging at the woman's sleeve. Daddy's making honey cakes, and if we don't go now, he'll eat all the crispy edges. The woman allowed herself to be pulled up, the wooden bird cradled in one hand. As she followed the girl inside, the scent of warm honey and cinnamon wrapping around her like an embrace, she realized something with a quiet jolt. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't dreading tomorrow. Perhaps that was a kind of belief, too. Morning arrived with the gentleness of a hand brushing away tears, sunlight spilling through the cabin windows in liquid gold pools that set the dust motes dancing. The woman stood by the hearth, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of mint tea, watching as Elias packed a small satchel with provisions, a loaf of dark bread wrapped in cloth, a wedge of cheese, a handful of dried apples. His movements were methodical, unhurried, as if he had done this many times before for many other lost souls who had stumbled into his quiet world. Mira hovered nearby, her small face unusually solemn as she clutched the now-healing rabbit against her chest, its splint removed just that morning. The woman's throat tightened. She had known this moment would come, had known, logically, that she could not stay forever in this hidden haven where time moved differently and grief felt less like a stone and more like something that could, perhaps, one day be set down. But now that the moment was here, her feet seemed rooted to the floorboards, unwilling to carry her back to the world beyond the trees. You don't have to go, Mira blurted suddenly, her voice cracking like a twig underfoot. You could stay. We could plant a garden together, and you could teach me to sew proper stitches, and... Elias rested a hand on his daughter's shoulder, stilling the torrent of words. Mira, he said softly, not unkindly. The girl bit her lip, her eyes glistening. The woman knelt before her, setting aside her tea, so she could take the child's small hands in hers. You found me when I was lost, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. And you showed me how to mend things, even things I thought were too broken. She glanced at the rabbit, its nose twitching contentedly. But some paths are meant to be walked, even when we don't want to leave the fire. Mira sniffed, then suddenly flung her arms around the woman's neck, squeezing so tightly it stole her breath. Then you have to come back, the girl whispered fiercely into her shoulder. Promise. Even if it's just to visit. Even if you're not sad anymore. The woman closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of sun-warmed cotton and wild grass that clung to the child. I promise, she murmured and realized with a start that she meant it. Elias handed her the satchel, his gaze holding hers for a long, wordless moment. In his eyes, she saw no judgment, no expectation, only the quiet certainty of someone who knew that healing was not a straight road, but a winding one, with room for doubling back. The woods remember the way, was all he said. And so she stepped out into the morning, the sunlight falling across her shoulders like a cloak as she followed the path back toward the village. The wooden bird rested in her pocket, its smooth wings a comforting weight against her thigh. She did not look back, not because she wanted to forget, but because she knew with a certainty that settled deep into her bones that this was not an ending. Somewhere behind her, a child's laughter rang out, bright as a bell, and the wind carried it to her like a secret. The woman squared her shoulders and walked on, her steps lighter than they had been in years. Did this story speak to your heart? If you've ever found solace in unexpected places or carried a grief that felt too heavy to name, you're not alone. Subscribe for more tales of healing, hope, and the quiet magic hidden in ordinary moments, because sometimes the stories we need find us exactly when we're ready to listen. Turn the page. The next chapter is waiting.